And welcome to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Chapter 3. Just as a quick summary of the previous chapter, Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, who is the character whose bias Stevenson is taking so far in the novel, has become a little bit obsessed with Mr. Hyde. He hasn't met him previously, and the only thing that he's heard about him is, first of all, that his friend Mr. Enfield, who he goes on his walks with, told him about the strange story where he met this gentleman that ran into a little girl and trampled over her, and the family sought compensation for this, and it was Mr. Hyde that did the deed, and it was him who took the check of, we later find out, of Dr. Jekyll. And the only other occasion that Mr. Utterson has had any contact with Mr. Hyde is through the will of Dr. Jekyll, which he holds in possession in his safe. And if you recall, the contents of the will stated that either on the death of Henry Jekyll or his disappearance for anything more than 3 months, all of his possessions would fall into Edward Hyde with no questions asked. And the chapter ended with him becoming a little bit obsessed with wanting to find him. And if you recall, he frequently went to the back door of Jekyll's house, as it turns out, which is where Enfield saw Hyde come and go when he got the check, in order to try and see him. And after several nights of watching and waiting, he does indeed bump into him, and they have a bit of a confrontation where Mr. Hyde is quite rude to Utterson, especially when Utterson says that they have friends in common in the form of Henry Jekyll, and that's who he's spoken to him about. And of course, Hyde knows that Henry Jekyll has never talked to Utterson about Mr. Hyde, because of course Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde are the same person. And so he left it where we left chapter 2, where Utterson then decided to go and visit Henry Jekyll in his home, which is obviously just around the corner from the back door in a big square. And when he gets there, he's quite relieved to see that Henry Jekyll isn't at home. But then he goes home and he's quite concerned about the whole event. The main reason being is that he strongly believes that Mr. Hyde, Edward Hyde, is blackmailing Henry Jekyll, Dr. Jekyll, for something that he's done in his past. And Utterson is determined to try and stop this happening, and that his main decision will be to perhaps dig up into the past of Edward Hyde himself to try and find something negative about him that they can use to counter blackmail him against Henry Jekyll. And his final words were if only Henry Jekyll would allow him to help him. So we're going to chapter 3 then. Chapter 3 is a relatively short chapter. It's less than 2 pages long, so we can see that the story's starting to pick up pace a little bit here. The chapter is called Dr. Jekyll Was Quite at Ease. Now, we are 3 chapters in, and it's the first time that we meet in person Henry Jekyll. So we've already met Edward Hyde, and now we're meeting the other person for whom the novel is named after, Henry Jekyll. And the fact that the title of the chapter is Dr. Jekyll Was Quite at Ease, suggests that when we meet him in the chapter, he seems relatively calm and comfortable and peaceful. So it's almost it's like it provides a juxtaposition between Utterson's feelings and his concerns and fears for Henry Jekyll, but then the Henry Jekyll that we see in reality. However, as the chapter goes on, that there is a distinct change in Henry Jekyll when he's spoken to by Utterson, because we are seeing the narrative, of course, as we know, is third person, but it's taking the bias of Mr. Utterson, and the only opinions that we've heard from so far, other than Mr. Enfield, are Utterson's himself. So this chapter here, it sort of it allies some of his fears, but also it confirms some of them as well as we get further into the chapter. Okay, so Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. Chapter 3. A fortnight later, by excellent good fortune, the doctor gave one of his pleasant dinners to some 5 or 6 old cronies, all intelligent, reputable men, and all judges of good wine. And Mr. Utterson so contrived that he remained behind after the others had departed. Now, when he talks about the doctor gave one of his pleasant dinner parties, this is a reference to Dr. Jekyll rather than Dr. Lanyon, who we met in the last chapter. And again, this is another quite key element of Victorian society, that people like this, gentlemen like this, would have dinner parties, and it would be their way of socialising, their way of talking through events. There'd be some perhaps quite political conversations that will go on, but it's very much a way of networking with one another. We've got 5 or 6 old cronies. Old cronies in this case means sort of old friends, so people they've known for quite some time. And as we can see, what we saw earlier in the book in chapter 1 about Utterson, he's somebody that people trust. And in this case, Utterson contrived to remain behind. So he's sort of fixed it in his head, so that he remains behind with Dr. Jekyll after the others have left the dinner party. And so this is his opportunity now to talk to Dr. Jekyll. Because if you remember at the start of the end of the last chapter, Utterson tried to go and speak to Dr. Jekyll at home, but he wasn't at home. This was no new arrangement, but a thing that had befallen many scores of time. Where Utterson was liked, he was well liked. Hosts loved to detain the dry lawyer when the light-hearted and the loose-tongued had already their foot on the threshold. The threshold just means the doorway, the exit to the entrance to the doorway. So in other words, this is something that happens quite commonly, that people that host dinner parties quite like to keep him behind to chat to him when the others have gone. So it seems that they've perhaps had fun and entertained each other and had good light-hearted conversation throughout the dinner, but it's often Mr. Utterson, for people that like him, it's often Mr. Utterson who they like to keep behind and have perhaps a more serious end of the evening chat with. They like to sit a while in his unobtrusive company, practising for solitude, sobering their minds in the man's rich silence after the expense and strain of gaiety. So we have another insight into the way that Utterson is portrayed here when it talks about that people who want to keep him behind and talk, when it says that it talks about Utterson's unobtrusive company. Unobtrusive means that it doesn't get in the way. He's not some big bold character that people feel that they have to entertain. He's somebody that's quite calming, and that Stevenson uses words like solitude, sobering, and silence. Note the sibilance there, the repetition of the S sound there, all of which adds to this calmness that surrounds Utterson. To this rule, Dr. Jekyll was no exception, and as he now sat on the opposite side of the fire, a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50, with something of a slyish cast perhaps, but every mark of capacity and kindness, you could see by his looks that he cherished for Mr. Utterson a sincere and warm affection. So that description there is actually the first description that we have of Dr. Jekyll. Look at the language that Stevenson uses. He refers to him as a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50, with something of a slyish cast, perhaps. Now, if you juxtapose that with the descriptions of Edward Hyde that we've seen in the last couple of chapters, where he was described as small and pale and dwarfish, we can start to see the way that Stevenson is looking at this juxtaposition between the very well-developed side of Dr. Jekyll, which is the side of him that he's shown to humanity for 50 years, as opposed to this relatively new character of Edward Hyde, who we find out later he's only been using, he's been turning into for perhaps a year or so by this point, which suggests that the evil side of Dr. Jekyll is relatively undeveloped, whereas the good side of him, that we find out later, he describes as 9/10 good, is large, well made. So there's something quite substantial about him. "I've been wanting to speak to you, Jekyll," began the latter. "You know that will of yours." A close observer might have gathered that the topic was distasteful, but the doctor carried it off gaily. "My poor Utterson," said he, "you are unfortunate in such a client. I never saw a man so distressed as you were by my will. Unless it were that hide-bound pedant Lanyon and what he called my scientific heresies. Oh, I know he's a good fellow, you needn't frown, an excellent fellow, and I always mean to see more of him. But a hide-bound pedant for all that, an ignorant, blatant pedant. I was never more disappointed in any man than Lanyon." So when they're first alone, then we see that Utterson begins to question Jekyll straight away about the will. Now, if you look at the language that's used here, Stevenson says a close observer might have gathered that the topic was distasteful, but the doctor carried it off gaily. So it's implying here that if only somebody that was watching very carefully would notice perhaps that Jekyll was put off, that the topic was distasteful, so something they didn't want to listen to, didn't want to hear about, but only if you were looking very carefully. However, the fact that the doctor carried it off gaily suggests that he's able to brush over his annoyance at Utterson bringing up the subject of the will. And look at how Jekyll responds to Utterson. He says things like, "You are unfortunate in such a client," in other words, himself. "I never saw a man so distressed as you were by my will." So Jekyll is acknowledging the fact that Utterson is quite distressed by the contents of the will, which gives all of Jekyll's possessions debt to this Edward Hyde that up until that point nobody really knew of or heard of. And then look at the way that Jekyll suddenly turns his conversation here to talking about Lanyon. Now, if you remember in the previous chapter, when Lanyon was questioned by Utterson about Jekyll and about whether he'd heard of Mr. Hyde, Lanyon said that they hadn't spoken to each other really for 10 years, that they'd had a falling out. And Lanyon describes it as unscientific balderdash. Look at the way here that Stevenson has Jekyll talk about Lanyon. He says that he's a hidebound pedant. Now, a pedant, you've probably heard the word or part of the word before in the word pedantic. And if you're pedantic, it means that you're very picky about something, that you're quite exact about things, that you perhaps don't do things outside of your comfort zone. And so here we can see that Jekyll regards Lanyon as being a pedant, somebody who is very precise about things, that's perhaps quite traditional. And if you call somebody a pedant, it's an insult rather than a compliment here. And he keeps referring to him here when he talks about him. He says he's a good fellow, but a hidebound pedant for all that, an ignorant, blatant pedant. And that the language here where it juxtaposes beautifully, where Lanyon previously referred to Jekyll as being involved in unscientific balderdash meaning rubbish, whereas Jekyll refers to Lanyon here as being a pedant. So if you're really astute as a reader, you'll notice that perhaps Lanyon's view of medicine and science is quite traditional, quite pedantic, quite exacting, whereas Jekyll, it seems, according to Lanyon, is somebody that perhaps is dealing with things that he shouldn't be, this unscientific balderdash or rubbish. And look at Jekyll's final statement there where he says, I was never more disappointed in any man than Lanyon. Which would perhaps suggest that maybe Jekyll has confided a little bit in Lanyon in the past about some of his ideas, but that Lanyon refused to listen to them and certainly didn't want to get involved in them. You know I never approved of it, pursued Utterson, ruthlessly disregarding the fresh topic. The thing that he's talking about never approving of here, of course, is the will. My will? Yes, certainly I know that, said the doctor, a trifle sharply. You've told me so. Well, I tell you so again, continued the lawyer. I have been learning something of young Hyde. The large, handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips, and there came a blackness about his eyes. I do not care to hear more, said he. This is a matter I thought we had agreed to drop. What I heard was abominable, said Utterson. Abominable means something very, very terrible and usually very wicked or sinful. So we can see here that Utterson is kind of true to what we've seen him as a character so far, in the sense that he's very loyal to friends, but equally he's very protecting of them. He's adamant that he wants to talk to Jekyll about the will and about Edward Hyde, particularly now that he's finally met him at the back of the house. And look at Dr. Jekyll's reaction, where it says that the large, handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the lips, and there came a blackness about his eyes. Especially the notion of the blackness about his eyes suggests something quite dark, quite secret, or quite wicked. And look at it when he says, this is a matter I thought we had agreed to drop. But Utterson refuses to let the matter drop. He pursues it, which in some ways would be annoying to Jekyll, but actually it shows that his loyalty to his friends and the desperate way that he wants to protect him. Because at this point, Utterson is firmly under the belief that Dr. Jekyll is being blackmailed by Edward Hyde for some sin of his past. It can make no change, said Jekyll. You do not understand my position, he returned, with a certain incoherency of manner. I'm painfully situated, Utterson. My position is a very strange one. It is one of those affairs that cannot be mended by talking. Jekyll, said Utterson, you know me. I'm a man to be trusted. Make a clean breast of this in confidence, and I make no doubt I can get you out of it. So when Utterson asked him to make a clean breast of it in confidence, if you make a clean breast of it, today would probably suggest that you are getting something off your chest. So you're making a clean breast of it. And when he talks about it in confidence, he means in secret, just between the two of them. So Utterson here is giving Jekyll a very, very valuable opportunity in letting him tell him what's going on, so perhaps that Utterson can help him. My good Utterson, said the doctor, this is very good of you. This is downright good of you. And I cannot find words to thank you in. I believe you fully. I would trust you before any man alive. Aye, before myself, if I could make the choice. But indeed, it isn't what you fancy. It's not as bad as that. And just to put your good heart at rest, I will tell you one thing. The moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. I give you my hand upon that, and I thank you again and again. And I will just add one little word, Utterson, that I'm sure you'll take in good part. This is a private matter, and I beg of you to let it sleep. Now, Jekyll is obviously quite keen to get Utterson to stop talking about Edward Hyde and the will. And he begins, of course, here. First of all, when he says about my position is a very strange one. It's one of those affairs that cannot be mended by talking. That would perhaps lead Utterson to even more strongly believe that he's been blackmailed. Of course, we find out later on that it's not. We find out that, as he says here, I can tell you one thing. The moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. We find out later that's because, of course, that it's one and the same person, and that the potion that Jekyll takes to turn into Hyde is something that he can stop whenever he chooses. However, much later on in the novel, when we hear the full confession of Dr. Jekyll in chapter 10, we learn that as time goes on, the more he took the potion, the less control he had over Edward Hyde. Because as he started doing more and more wicked deeds, the character in his head of Mr. Hyde became stronger, and it stopped being the case that he was having to take the potion to become Edward Hyde, and he starts involuntarily turning into Edward Hyde without taking the potion. And there's a point in the very later parts of the novel where he has to take the potion to turn back into Dr. Jekyll because his body involuntarily turns into Edward Hyde without him being able to stop it or be able to control it or even sense it happening. So that's quite an ironic statement when he says, the moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. Okay, because at this point, behind the scenes, Jekyll has full control over the experiments and him turning into Edward Hyde or not. But of course, as we find out that the longer this goes on, the less control he has and the more control that Edward Hyde takes from Dr. Jekyll. But look at the secrecy that Jekyll once again implores of Utterson, where he says, this is a private matter and I beg of you to let it sleep. Now, of course, we come back once again to this notion of the Victorian gentleman and their reputation. It seems that Jekyll is desperate not only to get Utterson to stop talking about it, but also to have him not talk to anybody else about it in order for his reputation to remain intact. Utterson reflected a little, looking at the fire. I have no doubt you are perfectly right, he said at last, getting to his feet. Well, but since we've touched upon this business, and for the last time, I hope, continued the doctor, there is one point I should like you to understand. I have really a very great interest in poor Hyde. I know you've seen him. He told me so, and I fear he was rude. But I do sincerely take a very great interest in that young man. And if I'm taken away, Utterson, I wish you to promise me that you will bear with him and get his rights for him. I think you would if you knew all, and it would be a weight off my mind if you would promise. So here, knowing what we do later on in the novel, in hindsight, Dr. Jekyll's comments here are really quite ironic when he says, I have a really great interest in that poor Hyde. And because we discover, of course, that they are one and the same person, Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde. And Utterson really is being played upon here by Jekyll, because Jekyll understands Utterson's good nature when he says, I wish you to promise me that you will bear with him and get his rights for him. I think you would if you knew all. And as I said, he's playing on Utterson's goodwill and his loyalty and his trustworthiness here by making him promise that if anything were to happen to Jekyll, that Utterson would help Hyde to get what his rightful possessions, which of course would be the items and the wealth from Dr. Jekyll's will. I can't pretend that I shall ever like him, said the lawyer. I don't ask that, pleaded Jekyll, laying his hand upon the other's arm. I only ask for justice. I only ask you to help him for my sake when I am no longer here. Utterson heaved an irrepressible sigh. Well, said he, I promise. So that's the end of the chapter. As I said, it is really quite a short chapter. And just to think about the ending there, we can see here that going along with this theme that Utterson becomes the detective for the reader, we see here that we have more and more involvement with him in the story. The fact that he's been dragged into the story now by Dr. Jekyll, who is asking him to kind of fight for Edward Hyde's rights. Now, as a lawyer, especially a lawyer with a certain sense of morality, this was very difficult for him to do. In the sense that he's met Edward Hyde and he hasn't liked what he's seen of him or the things that he heard of him from Enfield. But of course, as a lawyer, a trustworthy man and also a good friend of Dr. Jekyll, he feels compelled to do as Dr. Jekyll is asking him to do so. Okay, so if you have a look at the questions now, and then that'll be end of chapter 3.